Well, we've come to the Gospel of Mark and chapter 8. Last week, we took a brief pause in order to have a sermon specifically focused on Easter, but for the weeks preceding that, we've gone through one chapter at a time, moving through the Gospel of Mark, and here we come to chapter 8. Now, let's remember a few things that will be relevant to keep in mind that have happened in the last couple of chapters. If we look back in chapters 6 and 7, there's a few things that are going to sort of come back around again in the theme as we move through chapter 8. If we look back at chapter 6, we remember that there was the account of the feeding of the 5,000. And we see here Jesus lifting the bread in blessing. There's going to be something similar you may have noticed happening in the chapter today. There were also some other things that we noticed in the last couple of chapters that there's a bit of a similar theme. Jesus spoke against the Pharisees. We remember there were some things specifically about their customs of withholding any money that they would be using for assisting the elderly parents, and instead making sure that wasn't used in that way to follow the custom that they had to override God's law. And so Jesus was speaking against the Pharisees previously, and we'll see some of that same theme come back around. And also, in chapters 6 and 7, and even many other chapters, we've seen Jesus healing people. Particularly at the end of chapter 7, there's a time when Jesus heals a man who was both deaf and mute. We see this here. And the last verse there in chapter 7, the people responded. They saw this. And they understood something of who Jesus was. They said, "He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." They're amazed. And they're seeing this. And we're going to see how Jesus builds on some of these same things as we move through chapter 8. We'll take this message in 5 parts. We'll look firstly about something with a feeding. We'll hear next something about the Pharisees. Someone will see him face to face. There will be some things in Philippi, that is Caesarea Philippi. And lastly, there will be a foretelling. Starting with this feeding, verse 1 says that there was a great crowd that had gathered to Jesus. We see a great crowd has come. Some of them were coming because they wanted to be healed. Some of them were coming because they wanted to hear Jesus teaching. They wanted to come to Jesus. They'd heard about him. They wanted to come and see him. They wanted to be with him. And there were many of them. It wasn't just a few. It was thousands. And they were coming to see Jesus. Let's remember where Jesus is. We saw this last week in chapter 7. If you look there in verse 31, it mentions how Jesus had been way up out of Israel in Syria, and then he had headed down and once again to another area that's not really so much in Israel, but is the region there known as the Decapolis. And so Jesus is in a Gentile region, and there are lots of people coming to him. I think that's great. It shows us that there were times, even in Jesus' own ministry, that he is ministering to the Gentiles. And so Jesus is there, and there's lots of people who are coming to him, and Jesus notices something about them. He says there that they have nothing to eat, and it's been a few days. I think perhaps they came with a couple of days' provisions, and it's now been 3 days, and they've run out of supplies, but they don't want to leave. They want to be with Jesus, even if they know that they're running out of the practical things that they might think they need. Jesus sees this, and it says he has compassion on them. He recognizes the problem. He mentions this. And interestingly, he mentions it to his disciples. He comes to the disciples, and he says to them, "I have this problem," as if he's asking them for the solution. I think Jesus well knows that they're not going to be the solution. But Jesus has a purpose in asking them. He wants to see how they'll respond. So he says he has compassion on the crowd because they've been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. Some of them were probably fairly local. Some of them have come some distance, though. And he says they're not going to be able to make it home well, as they've already run out of food. Jesus is presenting this need to the disciples, and he's seeing what they're going to say, how they're going to respond. They've been there a long time. I really like how the crowd has been there. They're setting aside what would be the practical matters of making sure they're all set, making sure their comfort's cared for. They care about seeing Jesus more than they care about their own comfort, or in this case, even more than comfort. It's really their ability to get home well. Maybe you could even say their own safety. They care about being with Jesus most. That's what they came for. But Jesus has compassion for them. He doesn't want them to go home empty. So he asks the disciples. Now we just remembered it was only a couple chapters ago that there was the feeding of the 5,000. I imagine, as I'm reading through this, I have great hope for the disciples that perhaps one of them would say, "Oh, Jesus, I remember there was something similar to this not long ago. Perhaps we could seek God for something just like we had." They could say, "Jesus, you know everything. Surely we trust you. What do you say is right for this time?" The disciples don't have that kind of an answer. Instead, they say, "How can one feed this people with bread here in this desolate place?" It's desolate. That means there isn't some big city right there with lots of markets to buy food. They say, "I don't know. What could we do? What could possibly be the solution?" That was the disciples' response here. They're not sure what they could do. This teaches us something about what we observe not just in the disciples, but really in every Christian, that Jesus will show us some lesson, show us some example of his power, and it doesn't take long until many of us are back to square one, and we need the same lesson and the same example and demonstration again to see where Jesus is headed. The disciples saw where Jesus had his power to provide. They saw it firsthand with the feeding of the 5,000. And it doesn't take long until they're back to square one. And it's easy to look at the disciples and say, man, they could just flip back a couple pages. This is not hard. And miss that that's very true in our own lives. You may not have your life written out as a story where you turn back a couple pages. But if you think on it, you say, yeah, I remember that God showed me this very same lesson, and a month went by and I'm already losing track of it. That happens so often. And so we want to recognize in humility the same kind of needs in ourselves that we're observing in the disciples. We know something about this. God often brings up a need before he mentions the solution. Jesus was doing that with the disciples, and he's seeing how they'll respond. Are they going to respond in trust of him? Are they going to trust him? God will often do this, where he shows the need, and it's a little while before we see the solution, or at least before he brings it up. And often the same test comes around a few times. And that is important because it builds our faith, and it helps us to really see who God is. It helps us to sink in. Now, looking in verse 5 and so on, Jesus takes over by presenting now the solution. He asks the disciples, well, what food do you have available? And they say, well, we have 7 loaves. A little later it also mentions they have a few fish. That is not much to go around. They have thousands and thousands of people to feed, and they say, well, here's enough for 1 or 2 people. And that's what they have with them at the moment. And Jesus says, this is good. And he takes that, and he prays for it. It says he gave thanks. He broke them, gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they give it to the crowd. Jesus had the crowd sit down, and they're able to pass it out to everyone. And everyone is able to eat as much as they need. That is amazing. This shows us a few things, some principles of how God works. We can see some principles of God's economy here. God will point out a need. He might say, as you're following him, well, you see this need. And then he may ask you to give something to that. In reality, God asks us to give everything we have to him. Now, not every need is something that he's laying on our hearts, but everything we have is his. And he may use that to meet various needs around. And if you say, well, this is great, I've got these things and I can meet these needs, if you start to look at it, you will quickly find that what you have is very inadequate. You say, well, God's given me these children and He's given me this amount of capacity and these ability to care for people, and suddenly you realize, oh, I'm very much unable to care for eternal souls. If God gives you some amount of finances and you say, well, this will be great, and then suddenly you say, oh, this really doesn't supply everything needed. There's so much more that we need from God constantly. And so God is the one who really ends up providing everything needed, because everything is from Him. And so this is what happens for the disciples. Jesus says, here's the need. The disciples say, well, we have this little amount. And Jesus says, thank you. You've given everything to me. Now look at the abundance I can provide. We see the people here, they're eating, and it says something about this. It says they ate and were satisfied. You say, wow. And more than that, they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full, and there were about 4,000 people. Now, similar to with the feeding of the 5,000, that does say it's uniquely referring to just the men who would be sitting in one section. And so there would be probably thousands more, and we don't know how many more thousands. It would be a lot of people. This is an amazing miracle. And oftentimes when you're reading through this, you can say, well, it's sort of just the same thing all over again. Which is wonderful because it's showing how God repeats and shows things. He gives us things to see, and then to see again. But oftentimes, He does it with little differences. And if you look closely, you can see that Jesus isn't doing everything always the same. And that's also important to remember, because not every need is the same. Not every situation is the same. And every time, there's going to be something that's a little different. And so we don't just say, well, I remember how God did something once and assume He's going to do the exact same thing. God does different things to be providing for different needs. And we can note even a few differences between these stories. There's somewhat fewer people. The people were there for multiple days. The feeding of the 5,000 was a little more spontaneous. The people all saw Jesus going somewhere and ran around to meet Him, and it was all happening in one day. In this case, they had been there for several days. This time, Jesus was in a Gentile area. There's something a little different. By the way, you may not notice this readily just reading through the text, but if there's a lot of Gentiles there, and there's Jesus and His disciples, they all just had a big meal together. That isn't a typical thing that the Jews would want to be doing. They wouldn't want to host Gentiles for a meal. That's something Jesus is doing as He's providing for these ones who came to hear Him. There was a little bit more food to start. Not everything starts the same. You might look around and you say, well, I have a certain amount of gift that God's given me. And it doesn't exactly match what gifts God has given someone else, but He can make up the difference. And our little starting variations really don't matter that much. Whether your gifting is to start with 5 loaves or 7 loaves, God is the one who really provides. Also, there was more left over. Some of you who are good at reading may be wondering, how is it that there's more left over? Previously, we saw more baskets left over. There were 12 baskets left over. And in this case, it says there were only 7 baskets left over. Well, there's actually 2 different words for baskets used. One of them is the sort of one-handed basket, and there were 12 of those previously. And in this case, it's sort of the two-handed basket, and there were 7 of those. Another place that two-handed basket is referred to is when the Apostle Paul was lowered down outside of a city wall in a basket. So you're imagining one of those kind of baskets. I have a modern equivalent here. I don't know how many of us use baskets on a regular basis, but I think we might have some of these lying around the house. If you had a little plastic container that was, the personal size, that'd be a little different than the plastic container that's the big bin. And so in this case, there's a lot more left over. I don't think that went home with the disciples. There'd be a lot for them. Previously, it seemed like maybe they all had a little personal thing to take home. I think these bigger supplies may have gone with those who had the furthest to travel and needed an extra day's food. There was a lot left over. So Jesus is providing everything that is needed. We see here in verse 10, after Jesus had sent the crowds away, it says he got into the boat with his disciples. We see them here heading across the Sea of Galilee, and they went to the district of Dalmanutha. So Jesus is now headed back into a primarily Jewish region, back into the main section of Israel, and we are going to see what happens next. There's going to be something about the Pharisees, some direct confrontation with the Pharisees, and then some more teaching Jesus gives that has the Pharisees mentioned as well. We come now to Mark 8 and verse 11. It says, "The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven. However, their purpose was not that they wanted to see God. Their purpose was to test him." Someone might wonder, well, what's so wrong with that? They're seeking something from God. They really weren't. They were seeking to discredit Jesus. The thing that I would really describe as their main problem is that they were putting themselves in a place of authority over Jesus. They were saying, we're the spiritual authorities around here, and you prove to us who you are. Anytime you put yourself in authority over God, it does not go well. If you find yourself leading God and you say, God, I've got this plan, and could you please figure out how to fit in with it? It's not going to go well. This is what the Pharisees are doing. And they wanted to disprove Jesus' ability to make the claim that he's from God. Jesus speaks to them. It says he sighed. There's a disappointment. He says, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." He says, you're looking for some giant miracle from heaven right now? That's not going to happen. Jesus does not submit to someone attempting to take authority over him. That doesn't work. He says, that's not what we're doing. We heard just last week in our story, as we were moving through the sermon about Easter, some things from the book of Matthew that was touching on this same point, but Jesus adds to what he said. The book of Mark often gives a concise version of each story, and some of the other Gospels give a little more detail of other things that were mentioned. And we see something else that Jesus had mentioned. He said there wouldn't be any sign given. There wasn't going to be any miracle at the moment. However, he did have one thing to mention. There was a sign they could look to. He said there was a sign of Jonah. He said, you remember Jonah. You've read about Jonah. You know what God did in his life. That was a sign of God's power. And there's something that's going to be similar that will happen for Jesus. He said, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Jesus said there will be a sign. It wasn't going to be given based on the Pharisees' demands. But Jesus said there would be something coming. We mentioned this also last week. When the Pharisees did get news of that sign, when a bunch of guards came and said Jesus rose from the dead, the Pharisees were not eager to receive that message. They didn't say, oh, we've been looking for that. Instead, they said, oh my, let's pay you off to lie about it. That was their attitude toward Jesus. They were not ready to be looking for Jesus. So Jesus leaves them, and once again, he gets into the boat. We see them, they like being in the boat together, and they're headed back across the Sea of Galilee toward yet another location. However, as they're along in the boat, as they're in the boat together, Jesus is going to continue to reflect on some of what has just happened. He's going to give them some teaching that's even related to the Pharisees and the kind of attitude and sin that they had. Verse 14 starts with a little background context, though. This does not have to do with what Jesus' teaching is, but gives us some context for how the disciples were thinking, what they had in mind. Verse 14 says, now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. You're going to want to keep that in mind, but keep in mind that that's not what Jesus is thinking about. That's what the disciples are thinking about. Jesus has a different message in mind. He says here, verse 15, watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. We just heard about the Pharisees. Jesus is also mentioning Herod. Herod would have been the local ruler, and there were ones who were part of his political group. You may have heard them referenced sometimes as the Herodians. And so Jesus is saying, let's watch out for this. There's some leaven there. Now, the disciples were a little slow on this, so we're going to make sure we're all following. We all know what leaven is. Here's some example here. Has anyone made any bread recently? A few of us have. It's been a little while since I made some bread. But you get some dough with the flour and all the things. You mix it together. And if you just cook that, it doesn't look so much like bread. If you add a little bit of yeast, it doesn't take much, but it gets all through and it makes a very different end result. It looks very different. And Jesus says that there's something like that that's happening with the sin of the Pharisees and with the sin of Herod. That if you add a little bit of that sin into your life, into a nation, it causes a very different result. So he's given this warning against leaven. And he's given two categories. And I think this is interesting. We can break this down. Let's hear this. There's two different forms of leaven he's describing. You might think, oh, well, I see there's the sin that's mentioned. But there's, in fact, two different ditches that he's describing. That of the Pharisees and that of the Herodians. And we can look at this way. The Pharisees had an obedience to tradition. They said that was required for righteousness. On the other hand, the Herodians didn't have any of that. They didn't need that. Instead, they said, you just live your great life, follow your desires. Morality is out the window. Just move on up in whatever way you see to navigate your life. We can describe these two ways of falling off the path as falling into legalism or license, to be licentious, that is. And both of these were sinful and corrupting. Jesus is warning against both of them. Interestingly, you might think these are complete opposites, that they'd never want to be with each other. The Pharisees and Herodians somehow found great unity together when they opposed Christ. They had extremely different lives. Their philosophies were going this way and going that way. But they were together in not being for Christ. And that's really what makes the difference. Are you for Christ? That is what is in the middle there. This is the lesson that Jesus is attempting to give, but the disciples are not tracking. Verse 16 says, they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. They think Jesus says something about leaven. Not too sure what he's mentioning. Another one of them kind of has a light bulb moment in a random corner of his head and says, oh yeah, I forgot to bring more bread. Thinks perhaps Jesus is worried about that. Perhaps Jesus is sort of trying to teach them a lesson about being more careful about the bread. And that isn't what Jesus has in mind. And Jesus knows that they're discussing this. Here they are once again in the boat. And so Jesus says, guys, we're not worried about the bread. And he says, having eyes do you not see and ears do you not hear? Do you not remember? He's referencing, as he says, do you not remember the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000? He says, don't you remember there was so much? We see pictures here, and look, the leftovers. They're bringing those baskets left over, and they have those other baskets that were left over. He says, we have plenty of bread if we ever need it. That isn't the thing we're worried about. The fact that the disciples were so focused on this, that was the thing on their mind, I think reveals something of a lack of trust. They were with Jesus, but they weren't really trusting that Jesus could care for them. They had to be worrying about whether or not they had sufficient. They were worried that they maybe didn't have sufficient. And that's what they had in mind. And Jesus asked them, don't you understand? We're not worried about the bread. There's something deeper here. There's so many times when God is leading us through life and we say, well, there's all these things I need to figure out and all these things I need to be prepared for. And we focus on that and we leave the spiritual importance to the side because we have to get all the physical, practical things ready. And God would say, no, I can take care of that. Seek me. Stick with me. We want to be looking to him first, and all the earthly needs will get figured out secondly. The book of Mark ends with the discussion right there. If you're reading along, you might say, okay, well, we see Jesus' question. However, as we mentioned, sometimes there's a little more that's added in one of the other Gospels, and if we look to Matthew, it gives the disciples' response, and it says, then they understood that he did not tell them to beware that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. It says we're not worried about the bread, about whether or not it's been baked properly, about if we have some leaven there, the customs there, whatever it is. He says we're not worried about any of that. We're worried about the Pharisees. We're worried about the sinful tendencies of neglecting God's word. We've come to the end of some things about the Pharisees, and now we're going to see something about one who gets to see Jesus face to face. I think this is a beautiful passage. There's so much here that gives a spiritual analogy for all of us. We see that there's a blind man. Jesus comes to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man to Jesus, and they begged Jesus that he would touch him. Here we see a picture of this. There's somebody who's helping his blind friend to come to Jesus. Starting with this friend who's bringing this blind man, I think that's a great spiritual analogy. If you stop and think for a minute, what does it sound like to say that you are bringing your blind friend to Jesus? To be sharing the gospel, to be bringing someone to see Jesus. We see this story played out physically, but there's so much that we can see how much more that would be true spiritually. If you see this friend, you think, oh, what a good friend. He's helping this blind man to come to Jesus. You'd say that's a really good friend. That's someone who's being very kind, very thoughtful. How much more kind, how much more considerate is it to introduce someone to Jesus spiritually? That's a far greater need. And to say, friend, let me show you Jesus. He's over here. Come to him. There's a far greater kindness there. This is what any good friend would do. So he's brought to Jesus. And Jesus has an interesting way of healing him. It says he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. Jesus didn't need a mob right then, at the moment. So they go out of the village. And it says, when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked, do you see anything? Here he is laying his hands on him. Some of us might be a little squeamish or something, and you aren't so pleased with some spit in your eyes as a thought. As we were going through chapter 7 before, my dad mentioned a story that once again applies to this. There was a group of people who had some, I guess you would describe them as witch doctors, who were known as spitters. And they would do a lot of things with spitting, and that was their way of healing people. Somehow it didn't work as well as what Jesus did. And when those people read about Jesus, they said, wow, our spitters can't do that. He is a greater spitter. And they said, we want to be his. We want to follow him. And I think that's beautiful because sometimes when you're reading through the Bible, you say, I'm not sure if that was inspiring to me. And it may not be the thing that's just for you, that really jumps out at you and inspires you, but there may be somebody else who that's the thing that they need to inspire them to come to Christ. And I think having two such stories gives yet an extra measure to those who find this inspiring to them. So there are some people who brought this man to Jesus. Jesus has taken him out, and he's now spit on his eyes and laid his hands on his eyes. And he asked the blind man, do you see anything? And he looks up, and he says he kind of sees something, but it's not quite there yet. And I've got a picture of the blind man's perspective here. You can all see this with me. He says, I see people, but they look like trees walking. You can see, you might be able to tell that there's some people there, but it's not so clear. From this, we notice, first of all, that this man hadn't been blind his whole life. He remembered what it looked like to see some trees. He knew something of what it was to see. But more than that, I find this miracle interesting because it happened in 2 stages. I'll ask you, was Jesus not doing so well that day and needed 2 attempts at his miracle? No, we don't think so? You might wonder, well, why? Why would Jesus take 2 tries to do something that he clearly could have just done immediately? And it reminds me of what had actually just been happening with the disciples. So often, there's a spiritual blindness that people have that only comes off in stages. We'll notice a couple things about this. There's really 2 things about this 2-part miracle. One is that there isn't an exact formula. No one can say, well, it didn't work because of this when you're looking for a miracle. Jesus does his miracles in various ways, and so we're not going to be able to find some pattern. And that happens spiritually too. Some people say, well, the way I came to understand this spiritual truth was just all of a sudden, I could just see it all. And some other people might say, well, the way I came to be spiritually no longer blind took some stages. Different people have different stories. This blind man got his sight in multiple stages. And if some people come to see spiritually in multiple stages, that's okay, if that's how Jesus is working, because that's what Jesus was doing even here. And I think that's what's happening even for the disciples. Do you remember how we were just saying that they didn't understand how Jesus was speaking about leaven? And then it said, well, they kind of understood that Jesus meant the Pharisees. At least Matthew's account gives us that. We might say, oh, they understand now. Well, I think they understand this much. There's still more. I think they're seeing, but they're not seeing clearly. In some ways, this reminds me even of how we see currently as compared to how we will see. The blind man is all excited. He can see everything clearly now once he's fully healed. And that is the condition that we are expecting in heaven. That's what we're really looking forward to. I really like this verse. In 1 Corinthians, it says, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we'll see face to face. If what you see of God currently is just as a sort of a dim view, I think it's a lot like those blobby trees walking around. And if what you can see of God currently is so wonderful, just imagine how much more wonderful it is when your eyes are fully clear and you can see him face to face. This blind man got to see Jesus face to face physically once he was healed. We are going to get to see Jesus face to face spiritually, fully in heaven. That is something to look forward to. I imagine it a little bit like this. Can you imagine if maybe you'd never really seen your family? You kind of knew them, but for some reason, you could never really see their faces. You could never really clearly see them. And then someday someone said, well, you can get this eye surgery or new glasses or something, and you could finally see your family. That would be exciting. You'd say, wow. It's a little like that, but so much more so for getting to see Jesus fully face to face. Well, we've seen something about seeing Jesus face to face, and now we're going to come to Caesarea Philippi. Jesus travels with the disciples. It says they head to the region of Caesarea Philippi. We can see this on a map. That's way up north, once again, outside of the main part of Israel. We're leaving where all the Jews would be there around Galilee. We're heading outside of that. By the way, you do not want to be confused about Caesarea Philippi's name. It's got a confusing name. This is not to be confused with the city of Caesarea or with the city of Philippi. Both of those are different. Caesarea is a nice port town there in Israel. Philippi is a nice city over there in Greece. Caesarea Philippi is neither of those. If you're reading through, you just want to keep that in mind. There's some difference. Caesarea Philippi, as we mentioned, is not in Israel. Jesus is headed there. We can see what it looks like, where Jesus would have gone. This is a picture that Daniel took when he and I were there. That is where the Jordan River begins. If you go to Caesarea Philippi, that cave there is exactly where it used to begin. The spring was there. That's where it would have begun in Jesus' time. An earthquake moved it slightly, so it's not coming out of the cave anymore. And if you look a little to the right, this is the thing I really wanted you to notice. There's some ruins. You can even see a little bit in the photo. There's a lot of pagan worship that happened there. This is an area Jesus took his disciples where no one was worshiping God. They all went there to be worshiping these various pagan idols. And Jesus is going to ask them who he is in this context. I think that's very interesting. And if you look around, there's a lot more. There's things carved there. There's ruins. There's a lot of temple there, a lot of pagan worship. In fact, the whole little area was referred to at that time as the gates of hell. That was how the Jews viewed it, because it was the center of pagan worship for that area. And so Jesus takes them to that area, and he asks them a question. He says, "Who do people say that I am?" He's asking the disciples. And the disciples respond. They give a few answers. We can examine the disciples' answers. They said, well, perhaps John the Baptist. Do you remember we even heard about how Herod had beheaded John the Baptist? And then when he heard things about Jesus, he said, surely this is John the Baptist come back to life. I think Herod was inclined to believe that, partly to ease his own guilt. And he said, surely that's John the Baptist. That was one idea. They said, perhaps it's Elijah. There were things even in the Old Testament that mentioned that Elijah would come again. So people thought, well, maybe it's Elijah. He's come. Or one of the prophets. He's some other prophet, some new prophet. Maybe he's something else. Those were the main theories, at least, that the Jews had about Jesus' identity. Jesus is asking them, who do people say that I am? You can ask the same question today. You might get a few different answers. I don't think most people are going to say, well, I'm sure he was John the Baptist. That isn't a common thing that I hear today. But you hear a variety of different things, lots of different things. And I mentioned just a few things that I might hear if I was at a college campus, for example, and sharing some things about Jesus. I might ask, well, who do you believe Jesus is? And some people might say, oh, he was probably a wise teacher. He had some good things to say. That's probably about it. Maybe he was a sort of magician. You know, he did a lot of cool things, some tricks, maybe some things that made people think he was really special somehow. Maybe he's just sort of a legendary character. Maybe he himself isn't completely fictitious, but a lot of the stories about him, maybe those are. That's kind of the idea. Maybe he's the Messiah, but not the Son of God. That would be a common perspective to run into. Maybe he was some sort of political activist where he just had in mind some things about Jewish politics. Or maybe he was a sadhu, a holy man, someone who had sort of achieved some holy, special spiritual state. These are some things people believe might be true about Jesus. But I notice, after Jesus asks that question, he doesn't dwell on it. He doesn't care to investigate all the things that different people might say about him, because that's not what matters. The thing that matters is, who do you say that I am? And this is a conclusion that each one has to come to personally. This isn't something where you can just say, well, some people say this and some people say this, and I'll just not be sure. You have to come to some conclusion on this point, because everything about life is based on who Jesus is. If Jesus is God, then being God, everything in life is based on him. And if Jesus is not God, then that's the complete opposite. And so you really do have to come to some conclusion. Who do you say Jesus is? There are many things in life you don't have to conclude on exactly. You could say, well, some people say this, some people say this, I'm not too sure. There's lots of things where you don't have to pick and dedicate your life to a decision. But in this case, you do. And so Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you personally say that I am?" And Peter responds. He says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." We see that mentioning here in Matthew, these verses. It gives a little more in Mark than Mark does. And Jesus then responds. He says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." I think that's cool. It shows us a few things. One, Jesus says, you're correct. Jesus is saying, yes, I am the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. That is who I am. Also, he says, this isn't something you just learned from some people. If you learn to say the right words in a response because of something you heard from some people, that doesn't satisfy this question. If Jesus asks them, "Who am I?" and he says, "Well, here's some words that I am repeating that I heard from some people," that doesn't give the full answer. Instead, one who's knowing Jesus and coming to him knows this in a spiritual way from God, to say, yes, this is Jesus. There's something deeper there than just repeating some words that you've heard from a person. And so Jesus says that this is who he is by saying that Peter is correct in saying who he is. And just like with the blind man who was told, well, don't mention it in the village, Jesus says, now's not the time yet. Let's not be mentioning that to everyone just yet. In not very long, it will be time to mention that to the whole world, but he says it's not quite time yet. And Jesus goes on and begins to teach them some things, and this will bring us now to the final part of our message, something about a foretelling. Jesus is going to be looking to the future, not very far in the future, some things that will happen to himself. We see this here in verse 31. It says, "He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." That is a very direct description from Jesus. It says, this is what's going to happen. It's going to look like this, and it's going to happen this way. It's very clear. The disciples weren't following so clearly. I think this is cool that Jesus begins mentioning this ahead of time, because it's going to be helping them to finally understand once it's actually happened. They don't really understand until afterward, but the fact that Jesus had begun mentioning it, I think, was helpful because it shows a few things. One, Jesus was expecting it. This wasn't a surprise. Jesus wasn't caught off guard. Also, Jesus isn't afraid of it. This is God's plan. And so looking back on it, once it's happened, the disciples can say, oh, I see, and this is good. I think this is also very interesting timing because we remember where Jesus is. He was up there at the very top of the map there at Caesarea Philippi. Jesus is now going to begin his journey to Jerusalem. Right in the passage we're reading, as he's moving along, he is now headed to Jerusalem to die. He's not headed there very quickly. He's going to take a little while. He's rather far from Jerusalem. He's going to go around through Galilee, and then down past Samaria there as well, and then Jerusalem is even off the bottom of the map. But the way Mark is written, the first half, Jesus is traveling around in various places, and then the whole second half of Mark, Jesus is heading really in one direction, and that is toward his death. And so this is an appropriate time to mention it to the disciples. And so Jesus says that this is what's going to happen. We see the suffering that Jesus would have at the hands of the Pharisees, his death and his resurrection. And this happens as he's heading south, or will happen when he arrives, that is. The disciples hear this, and Peter's always ready to speak up. Peter says he has a word for Jesus. He kind of brings him aside. Peter could have said, quietly, I don't really understand. Could you explain this? He could have given some humble question, saying, Jesus, what is this? Instead, he says, no, Jesus, I've got a word for you. I don't know what you're talking about, but I don't like it, and you better not do that. This is the same Peter who just earlier was saying he's the Christ, the Son of God. And now he says, no, I don't like your plan. We're doing it my way. Do you remember how we were mentioning the Pharisees wanted to take authority over Jesus and say, do you fit in with us on our authority over you? Peter's now trying the same thing, and it does not go well. It doesn't work. Jesus has a response for him. He says, get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. I think this is a very interesting verse. It shows us how easy it is, even for those who believe the truth of Jesus' identity, to fall into some sidetrack and say something that is joining on Satan's side. It is easy to be tempted to fall back into something, and Peter is in this case. Something else I notice, Jesus doesn't say Satan has been your main thought. Jesus doesn't say to Peter, you've been meditating on something of Satan. Instead, he says, your mind is on the things of man. And that is how you are identified with Satan. This shows us the default position of people. If your mind is on the things of man, then your mind by default is on the things of Satan because he is the ruler of this earth. He is the one who is taking the lead on everything that is not godly. And so if your minds are on human things, it's really on the things of Satan. Oftentimes people will say, well, I like to spend a lot of personal time with God, and that's good. And they'll say, well, and I also have some personal time that's sort of me time, time with my friends. I think it really looks something a little more like this. You have personal time with God that's allowing God to rule your mind. And that could be by yourself, it could be with other people, it could be in any context. And anything that isn't that, you could describe as personal time with Satan. You're allowing Satan to rule your mind. And you have those two options. There isn't the in-between option where you're just with yourself. Because when you're setting your mind on the things of man, you are identifying with Satan. You're joining his rebellion because it's anything that isn't with God. So Jesus rebukes Peter. He recognizes this and points this out. And then he begins to teach some more things about this. He says, in fact, here, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Jesus had just been describing about how he would go to the cross, how he would die. And now he says, actually, for everyone who follows him, this is going to be their same pattern. As you're following him, you're going to be taking up your cross. It may not look the exact same as what happened to Jesus' life, but it's going to be following the same kind of pattern. Keep in mind, when Jesus said this was before he died on the cross. The cross didn't have a Christian significance. The cross wasn't a happy Christian symbol. When Jesus is saying this to his disciples, the cross is just a symbol of a torturous death. That is what he's referencing. He says that is what we're going to do. And this is what it looks like to follow him. Because Jesus' servants walk in the same path that he walked. And this is what should happen to the fleshly nature of anyone who is serving God. Jesus goes on to say, we're here in verse 35, for whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. At first, this might sound like something of a paradox. How could that be? And when we recognize that it's talking about a spiritual eternity, suddenly we see. If you try to preserve your life in this world and hold on to it for yourself, you will in fact lose your life on an eternal scale. But by giving up this life, you gain eternal life. This is a call from Jesus for your flesh to die. Not just for it to be kind of minimized, set in a closet somewhere, for it to be gone, for it to be dead. To no longer have the kind of life in you, but instead to be dead in you. to lose your life for Jesus. Our friend Dietrich Bonhoeffer mentioned something about this, and he reminds us of how we see this played out in the rich young ruler who didn't take up this offer. He says, Jesus' summons to the rich young man was calling him to die. That's what we were just talking about. Because only the man who is dead to his own will can follow Christ. Do you notice that? It's one or the other. You can't have some of both. If you're going to follow Christ's will, your will has to be dead. Otherwise, you're going to have two wills going in two directions, and it will not work. It might look like it can for a short time, but it really will not. And Jesus mentions this really is worth it. Our song leader, Benj, was telling us this is a trade-off, but it is completely worth it. It's sort of a risk. It's something where you're saying, I'm sacrificing this. But when you look at it, you say, oh, I'm really sacrificing nothing. All I have is to gain. Because in Mark 8, verse 36 here, it says, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world? That thing you're giving up, it's really nothing. There's no profit if you're forfeiting your soul. The trade-off there is really no loss and all gain. That's what it is. There are people who seek a lot of fulfillment in this life, and they live extravagant, adventurous lives. And over they say, I don't know what it's about. I didn't find the meaning. I didn't find the fulfillment. You can live your whole life searching for it, and you will not find it. You don't even have to live your whole life in order to kind of pick up on that truth. I think if you can imagine when you were 5 or 10, there might have been something that was the biggest thing the world had to offer, at least from your perspective. You might say, I could gain the whole world if I had this, and it's some new toy. How much does it matter now? Not so much? It really doesn't. And it's the same thing. It never changes. Even if you're all grown up and you're still chasing something that's the biggest thing you see in the world, it's not going to matter. It won't end up fulfilling. Only Jesus will. Coming to the end of our message now, we look here at verse 38. Jesus says, for whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. This gives something of a question. Are you ashamed of Jesus? Are you reluctant to identify yourself with Jesus? Are you reluctant to live for him? Do you say, I don't know, that's kind of, I'd really rather be over here. If that is your attitude toward Jesus, you may find he has the same attitude towards you. If you say, I'm reluctant to be with him, he says he may be a little reluctant to be with you. And that is a terrible place to be. This brings us now to the end of our chapter. We each week have something that is an on your mark, something that is a summary, something that's a word that's worthy of being reminded of and remembering. And on that theme of remembering, we note that God often has to repeat himself. We saw that in this chapter. There's things that he repeats, and it's in order to get our attention or to remind us of something. This is something God does for us often, and it is good. Let's not ignore these repeated lessons. You say, I've already heard that. I'm set. That probably means you need it that much more. Instead, learn to walk in them daily. That is what it means to daily take up your cross. You're going to walk with Jesus daily, putting aside your own desires. And this will lead on the path of the greatest joy, and it will continue for eternity. That is what we've seen here in Mark chapter 8.